So welcome back, everybody, to another webinar organized by Princeton University's Bendheim Center for Finance. We're very happy to have Lisa Cook with us. Hi, Lisa.
Hi.
It's great to be with us, to have you. Lisa is an expert in many dimensions. She does research on macrofinance, also on innovation, and also has a lot of expertise on the African American community and the economic interaction with that, on the economic and social implications of racial disparities. And given the current circumstances, we are very glad to have her with us and shed some light on what's going on in the bigger picture and more long-run picture from also an economic and a social perspective. Thanks a lot, Lisa, for being with us.
As
usual, I'd like to do a little bit of housekeeping. So just some advertising. What did we have last time? We had last Friday Daryl Duffy with us. He was talking about how to redesign the US Treasury market and give some clear proposals how to improve the shortcomings of the US Treasury market. Lisa is with us today on the racial disparities. And on Friday, we have Ken Rogoff talking about the global sovereign debt going on, and there might be some crisis coming up, and the role of the dollar after COVID. The next Monday, Raj Chetty will talk about tracking with real data the COVID impact of COVID on business cycles, consumption, on many, many dimensions. So here's a new data set he will talk about as well. So what will we talk about today? Today we'll talk about the racial aspects. And I have to say up front that I'm not an expert at all in this area. So I will rely on Lisa to shed all the lights on it. So my introduction will be much more short-lived and short-term. I will, one thing which, following this current circumstances, what impressed me a lot is some interview the CEO of Merck gave, Ken Fraser, and he explained what made all the difference that he is so successful in the US. And what he said, what put my life on a different trajectory was that someone intervened to give me an opportunity to close this opportunity gap. So there was some administrator in the 60s who intervened and gave him the chance to attend a different school, and that made all of the difference, and that's where he is now. And that's why I think that this opportunity gap is a very important component. Of course, there are many other dimensions to it as well. But in general, if you want to live in a free society, everybody should have the equal opportunities. Otherwise, the society is biased and is not substantially free. So what I did is, with the help of my friend Jean-Pierre Landau, I put some chart together, but it's just some rough thoughts how things might interact. Of course, you would like to have some personal and social accomplishment as a person in society, and there's justice and law and freedom which you would like to enjoy as a person. And because of violence and racism, it is the case that justice might not be given, and that has implications on the opportunity gap. And the opportunity gap is a complicated interaction of many, many elements. So if you have racism, it's very hard for you to get the social capital. There's a social capital gap. There's a difference in education and training. Because of this difference in education and training, there's different buildup of human capital, which then makes the social capital more difficult to have as well. And on top of it, you might also come from a weaker social, financial background, and that might give slack to a financial capital gap. But all of these things interact. Of course, there are limits and the opportunities certain people in the society have, or certain members of certain communities have, and that limits, as I mentioned before, the freedom as well. Of course, it also has an implication to what extent these members of our society then can innovate and contribute to the economic growth, to the overall economic growth in our society. And given Lisa's expertise on the second dimension, on top of it, of the earlier dimension, we will learn today also much more about innovation, what the African American community could contribute or did contribute, and could even more contribute if we had a different modified arrangement. So let me just start with some. So if you look at this big chart, all this interaction, this web of interactions, the first question I would like to know from the audience as a starting point, it's a tough question, I have to admit. If you look at this framework, do we have to work on, is it all things we have to change simultaneously? Or is it the case that there are 2 or 3 key measures which will improve the whole framework. So we should start with the two key measures. I don't ask you to identify the 2 or 3 measures. Is it more on the education? Is this the key? And that will trickle down and change the whole dynamics, or some other dimensions, just to get a sense of that. My second question is, the current movement we have and see, which is to some extent also encouraging, do you think it will be short-lived, like the anti-school shooting movements, Occupy Wall Street movements, or do you think it will be a long-lasting change to the country? And then Lisa asked Lisa also to provide some questions, because she has expertise and I don't. That's more about innovation aspect to it. So when do you think was the peak years of the patents per capita for African Americans? Was it in 1875 to 1900? Was it 1900 to 1925? So that's the peak year per capita, or 1945 to 1970, or 1990 to 2015, just to get the sense of what you think about that. And then there's a question about the link between violence and economic growth. So for African Americans, but not for whites, hate-related violence has a negative and persistent effect on economic activity. So that's for the African American, but not for the whites. That's answer A. Answer B is for blacks and for whites. And answer C is then for whites, but not for African Americans. The same argument holds. So which one, A, B, or C? And then if you think about the size of an inventor team, so there's a title here. So if you invent something, what's the median size of an inventor team? Is it A, B, C, D? Is it 1, A, or 5, the median size, or 10 inventors, C, or 15? So if you can give us some quick answers, and then I will announce them. And then with this knowledge, I give the floor to Lisa, and she will enlighten us with her knowledge about it. Okay, so let me look at the, okay. I think the poll is closed. So we have to change the whole framework, or we have to work on all elements simultaneously. That's what 64% say. And 36% say there must be 2 or 3 key measures, which we might not know, but to start working on, and that will then trickle down in all the other dimensions as well. So then the current movement will be long-lasting, or will also fizzle out, like all the earlier movements. It will be long-lasting, 73% think. 27% think, no, it will not be long-lasting. For the patents, when did you think was, the era where the African American communities or inventors contributed the most to patents? Between 1875 to 1900, that's what 28% think. Between 1900 and 1925, that's what 20% think. After Second World War till 1970, that's 25% think that. Or from 1990, when the internet boom started, 2015, was it then? That's what 28% think. So even it's actually totally equally distributed almost. So it's not clear that there's some period standing out, given from the knowledge of our audience. And then the question was, which of the following timeframes include the peak years for patent and per capita for African Americans? So this was the next question for blacks, but not for whites, was 40%, or for blacks and for whites, both of them was 54%, or for whites, but not for African Americans was 2%, and there's no relationship between hate-related violence and economic activities, only 3% think this. The median size of the group of inventors, is it 1, 5, 10, or 15? Between 1 and 5, so 45% think it's 1, 45% think it's 5, and 7% think only it was 10, and only 3% it's 15. So the group is rather small. It's like writing an academic paper. It's, you have co-authors, but not 15. I think that's what our audience thinks at this point. Okay, so Lisa, now the floor is yours. I think it gives you a little bit of background what people think. You might tell us what the truth is in a few minutes. I'm very happy to have you with us, and talk to you soon. I will intervene with the questions, and hope the audience will come with questions, and I will collect the questions and pass it on to Lisa in a bundled form. Thanks again.
So thank you so much for the opportunity to give my impressions of the economic and social implications of racial disparities. Thank you for that kind introduction as well, Markus. So as we know, the COVID-19 pandemic exposed fissures in the economy and in society. That was along the dimension of health, along the dimension of employment, of work and occupations, along the dimension of income, the dimension of wealth, and certainly along the dimension of policing and violence. The fact that we were all home and looking at these videos being shared, at various acts of violence that included African Americans who were unarmed and killed by the police, meant that we saw something that was equivalent to Emmett Till's casket being open. What's the common feature among these? The common feature is systemic racism, I believe, which leads to the racial disparities that we see in each of these dimensions. How do we think about the origins, the channels, the implications of systemic racism? So there's a lot of literature on this. There was the North's lack of diligence and consistency on Reconstruction. That is Eric Foner's work, and there are a lot of others. There was entrenchment. There was a spread and legalization of racial animus following Plessy versus Ferguson, for example. So when this ruling took place, this Supreme Court ruling took place in 1896, there were lots of state laws that followed that allowed separate but equal in the American society. Wilson, President Wilson, directed the segregation of the federal government, and that was really detrimental to African Americans and their opportunities and the mobility they shared. What we found recently, and what some people knew at the time, was that urban renewal or redevelopment policies that were instituted in the 1960s deliberately destroyed Black neighborhoods with highways during the period of urban renewal. And now I think we can call this racist redevelopment policies. We know this from some of the deliberations related to these plans. And the outcomes are manifold with respect to schooling, housing, and redlining. Redlining caused these outcomes, these poor outcomes with respect to housing, and therefore wealth accumulation. With respect to car purchases, we have a number of audit studies that show discrimination in car buying and car purchases. We have studies that show discrimination and job callbacks. For example, Batraw and Mullinatham. We have evidence of ongoing segregation. That's the work of my co-authors and me, Trevon Logan and John Parman, looking at segregation and its roots and its implications. Racial disparities with respect to violence, racial disparities with respect to access to credit. This is a literature and it's not exhaustive. One thing that the literature didn't do was to address macro inputs and outcomes like innovation and GDP. One thing we know about innovation is that it is a key driver of the economy. And I typically think in the framework of Romer 1990 about endogenous economic growth, that we can change the underlying inputs such that we get unbounded technological progress and therefore unbounded economic growth. If we think about the current contribution of intangibles, so the application of technological advances. This is roughly equivalent to 10% of GDP. This is work of Corrado, Fulton, and Sickle. And what we know is that innovation is a driver of business investment, and that's roughly 20% of GDP. So this is large and important. And certainly we're concerned about them as concerned about business investment, concerned about innovation, because of the ability of these inputs to lead to higher living standards for everyone. So let me pivot to innovation, violence, and economic activity. Marcus, did we want to stop for a poll now, or should I continue?
No, you can just continue whenever there's a question. I will inject it. But do you want to conduct a poll, or?
I can continue. That's fine. That's fine.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
So, just to give you a brief lay of the land, there was a rash of race-related violence in the United States after 1870, between 1870 and 1940. And the kinds of violence that I look at are segregation laws, which peaked in 1908, 1928, and 1933, race riots or uprisings that peaked in 1919, and lynchings that peaked in 1892 and 1893. So this is the defining graph of this line of research. When I graphed the patents against the patents of African Americans and whites, certainly I thought they would be the same because inventors respond to the same incentives. Well, when I posted this, when I put both on the same graph, it seems as though there's a very different outcome for whites and for blacks. So blacks are in red, and the appropriate axis is the y-axis on the right, and for whites, the appropriate axis is on the left, and these are patents per million. And what we see is that in 1899, we have the peak year for innovation for African Americans, and not just in the 19th century. This is until 2010. I did the calculation through 2010, and that is still the peak year for African American invention. And then you see in 1900 this great divergence, and you never see recovery to the African American peak. The main findings of this paper and this research are that violence diminishes innovation and economic activity with persistent effects. 1899, as I mentioned, is still the peak year for patented per capita for African Americans. There is still a median number of inventors of one on patent teams, and there has been a lot of change in innovation since 1899, since the 19th century, but it is still, that patent size is still one for African Americans. Lynchings affect the patents of African Americans significantly, negatively, and significantly. So that's the right answer. Lynchings also affect white patents, but not significantly. Segregation laws hurt the most valuable patents of African Americans, electrical patents. The missing patents are equivalent to those of a medium-sized European country at the time. So that was fairly significant. So what I suggest is that from the 726 patents we should see 1,100. And that would be the size of a medium-sized European country at the time. So let's think about the counterfactual. So what if...
Can I just ask a question? The segregation laws, did they also imply that the patents were taken away from the African Americans? Or you could keep the patent?
So it certainly made it more difficult to defend their intellectual property. Yes. I mean, fundamentally, it was difficult to get to a central business district for an African American to get to a central business district because they'd become all white. So yes, intellectual property rights became much more difficult to defend. And certainly we have anecdotes of technology, of patents being confiscated due to this rise and segregation and discrimination.
And do you see patents just as a measure of a small, I mean, a much bigger thing? So there's a whole innovation going on. Many innovations are not patented at all, but you can't
Yes, right.
them directly. And you see patents just a particular measure of this? Or?
Right. And this is just a particular measure. Just happen to have this on a day-by-day patents issued, but based on the data, based on patent applications, but I have the patents issued and they're issued on and applied for on a given day. And that's what we merge with other data that happen on a given day for a given state. So, so this turns out to have the information, but it is an indication of, it's a crude indication of inventive activity. You're right, not everything is patented, especially in the South. There are innovations that happen so quickly that it's not worth patenting, and certain other sectors besides agriculture, for example, we don't see that much patenting. But for me, this is an indication not only of inventive activity, but just economic activity. And we can take the lesson from this to suggest what might happen to innovation more broadly if subject to this kind of violence, which is my next slide.
Okay.
So I look at predicted white patent activity if white inventors, the rest of the inventors in the data set had been subjected to similar violent activities and violent acts like African Americans. Now, the blue line is the actual line, the actual white patenting line. The red line is what would happen if subjected to similar acts of violence. And what we see is something really interesting, and this is the cautionary tale, actually, of the research. What we can see is that on average, it is more negative. This series is more negative. And what we also see is that it's much more volatile. And business investment would have fallen a lot more, would have fallen, first of all, and would have fallen likely significantly with this kind of series, facing this kind of series. This isn't the environment in which investors invest in new technologies. So this would have had a detrimental effect on business investment.
So Lisa, Asani would like to know why you mostly focus on the time series and not in the cross-section across US states, because some states might be more restrictive and less others.
In the paper, I do both. In the paper, I do both. In my 2014 paper in the Journal of Economic Growth, I actually do both. Okay. So I take advantage of the heterogeneity across states and across regions there. Yes.
And when you apply for a patent, you have to specify your race?
No, race is not recorded on the patents. This took a long time to collect. It took a long time to collect the data on African American patentees. I had to, first of all, identify the first ever historical Black names. So I had to create that to be able to match to the patents. That didn't work as well as I intended, but I had to use a lot of other series to develop this patent data set, including early 1900 surveys of agents, patent agents and patent attorneys that had Black clients. I had to look at obituaries. I had to really do some deep historical digging to be able to find and recover these African American patentees. So that was a big data haul, big data investment.
Thanks.
Okay, so another cautionary tale from this exercise, from this research, was that you want to not only prevent violence generically and in the abstract, you want to prevent the first lynching, because it's the first lynching that has the biggest effect. And there is a lesser effect when the number of lynchings grows. But the greatest impact on patents would be the first one. So you want to prevent violence, you want to prevent personal insecurity, you want to prevent the suspension of the rule of law, if at all possible, because this would be the outcome. So
can
if
I
we
just jump in here, there's some questions.
sure.
In terms of, you look at lynching, which is an extreme, violation of the rule of law.
Right.
What about education and other dimensions where you say you have disadvantage on the educational level? And what exactly are the channels which, can you characterize on that? So did you also look at, and is it immediately when there's lynching, immediately innovation level goes down, or there's a lag for a certain number of years?
So I control for education for schooling, so that's in here. But think about it. I want to be clear about what's happening at this time. The more important thing for invention at the time was to be numerate. Inventors weren't necessarily literate, right? So you don't get engineering schools, for example, until the late 19th century. And patents don't require this. They don't require, they don't require it now, but certainly there is a correlation between engineering and patent output. But then there wasn't this kind of association. And great inventors were often not literate. So that wasn't such a big, for the beginning of the time series, it's not such a big factor. Towards the end of the series, it will become so. That's when inventors started moving into corporate labs. There were already corporate labs being formed. And at the end of that period, we see some of the inventors who had moved into corporate labs. But even that was lagged for African Americans. My cousin, Percy Julian, who invented cortisone, was the first Black director of a corporate R&D lab, and that was in the 1940s, and that was at Glidden. So that was pretty late in the time series that goes to 1940. But even he, I mean, so if we're talking about violence, even he was subjected to this kind of racist violence. His home was firebombed twice, and he lived in one of the best neighborhoods in a suburb of Chicago. So we can certainly see how this could potentially have a damaging effect. This kind of increase in violence might have a damaging effect. Shall I continue, Marcus? Okay. So let's fast forward to talk about contemporary innovation and GDP. So the other line of research that I have related to innovation thinks about post-1970 innovation and innovative outcomes. And I look at 3 stages of innovation. So that's commercialized invention. I use the term innovation. So education, as Marcus was remarking, training, and that's training as a patenting inventor. You're in a lab often, and then commercialization. So what we know is that at each stage, there could be serious implications for income or wealth inequality. So if we think about education and the innovation economy, those who are trained, who are educated in STEM fields, will have much higher incomes than the average worker in the U.S. Economy. So we already know that there can be an income difference there, and that would be the biggest implication there. With respect to training, learning to be an inventor, certainly same implications for income, and potentially implications for wealth as well, because that's where people make the associations or create the social capital that Markus showed on the first slide, that the people that you work with in a lab, say in graduate school, are the ones you start inventing with going forward. So this is an important time that has implications for both income and wealth inequality. The commercialization has the biggest impact with respect to wealth inequality. Let's just see where that comes from. There are racial disparities in entrepreneurship. There are 50 white entrepreneurs for every Black entrepreneur. There are racial disparities in founders receiving VC funding. 1% of founders receiving VC funding are Black, and that's for the most recent period. That's 1% for African-American women, actually, and 5% for African-American men. So 1 to 5% of founders would be African-American. And that's a very, very small share, very small sliver. And they find funding, they may find funding in other places, but if we're talking about VC funding, external funding, this is external private funding that's non-bank, this is an important statistic. There are certainly racial disparities in tech firms and IPOs. So if we think about the 10 wealthiest people in the world, 7 of them are tech entrepreneurs, and none of them is African American. So this has serious implications. And the wealth, I mean, what we know about the wealth of individuals is that, of tech entrepreneurs, is that Jeff Bezos is approaching $1 trillion. That is the size of larger than many countries in the world, if not most countries in the world. So this can be a serious problem with respect to inequality. So what are we losing? This is a question that I ask in the research. What are we losing because of missing African Americans in this process? So what my co-author Yan Yang and I calculate is that we are missing out on between 0.6 and 4.4% of GDP per capita as a result of women and minorities not being, and African Americans specifically, not being more engaged in the innovation process, especially at the beginning. So at the point of STEM education. This is similar to the calculation of Hunt et al. 2014. And this is what they calculate is that it's 2.7% for women. And that has implications for living standards. If we're leaving money on the table by not including women and African Americans, certainly at the beginning of this process, to go through the rest of the process. And this is consistent with the findings of Shea and Clinow, who look at the misallocation of African American talent in the post-civil rights era. And certainly that's led to lower GDP for us all. So the misallocation of talent can have implications for GDP.
Lisa, that's a level shift, I guess, of 4.4%. No, that's the level of GDP would be higher.
Right. That's a level shift.
But shouldn't there be also a growth element to it, that the growth rate every year is, let's say, is 0.1% higher, which in the long run would make a much bigger difference?
Right. So we made our calculation to be similar to that of Hunt et al. So we're still, this is still a fairly new paper. So we were just doing a similar calculation to make it comparable. But yes, what we want to do, what we are doing in the final stages of the paper is doing the growth calculation. Yeah, that's right.
But can I come back to the initial question a little bit, that let's suppose you mentioned that it's very difficult for the African American communities to get funding in the VC market.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's also much more difficult to become an inventor because you don't have access to the same educational level. If you can correct one of these problems, which of the two would you see is more important? If the ultimate goal is to have better innovation going, would you put more resources on to make sure the VC market works, or would you put more resources on better education for a broader public? If you were, I don't know whether I can put you on the spot like that, but just
No. I think it's a really interesting question. I hate to sit on the fence on this one. I think, of course, education would have a lot more spillovers, but a lot of these founders are really educated, and they're not getting VC funding. So I'm not sure that that's the answer. I'll say more about this towards the end in the policy prescriptions. Did you have another question? Were there any other questions? Happy to pause here for a moment.
Let you talk a little bit. Thanks.
Okay, sure. So with respect to policy prescriptions, with respect to the research that I've presented, the 2 lines of research that I focused on, I think one of the most fundamental things that has to happen is that we have to learn about and address racism. And that's partly part of the answer I was giving to Markus, that there are a lot of educated people showing up at VCs asking for funding, and they're not getting funding. And we see systematic patterns of discrimination for different types of funding, not just VC funding. And we should encourage not just colorblind behavior, that's not sufficient, but anti-racist behavior, policies, and practices. And for those of you all who are economists, you know that the AEA came out with a statement last week, and we put some resources on the AEA website, and we included a reading list. So if you're interested in readings that would help you do this, then I would suggest viewing it and learning from it. I think another thing that has to be done is we have to admit that some of the policies and practices that we put into place have had severe and negative outcomes for African Americans, and not just African Americans. I'm focusing on African Americans here because that's my research, but it's had definitely poor outcomes for African Americans and others. So I would suggest, for example, the reversal of Prop 209 in California. So what a Berkeley Econ graduate student is showing is that it significantly diminished opportunities for mobility for Black students, particularly in tech. So if you look at the wage differentials before and after Prop 209, they are really significant. And this is, I think, a real problem for the UC system. It has a reputation of being one of the most mobility-centered university systems in the United States, and is touted for that. But one thing that we find is over time, this has had a negative effect on African Americans. And I would suggest in that case, adopting Texas-style targets of having, say, the top 10% admitted to, say, the UC system schools. That seems like a better outcome than the current one.
Explain to our international listeners what Prop 209 is.
Yes, so Proposition 209 barred affirmative action in admissions in California. And I'm just using California as an example for 2 reasons. First of all, it's the 5th or 7th largest economy in the world, first of all. And then secondly, there is a pipeline of graduates from Stanford and Berkeley to Silicon Valley. And if this is one of the ways in which African Americans can get a foothold into Silicon Valley, it's just been cut off. It's just really been cut off because of Prop 209. So that's why I am suggesting the reversal of it for reasons of fairness and to give everyone a chance at mobility. So a second policy prescription would be to improve the pipeline, especially the STEM pipeline. And that would include mentoring, but it's not just the pipeline. It is also the current environment that African Americans are working in. Some of you have probably seen, if you have followed me on Twitter, if you've been on Twitter for the past 2 days, there is a hashtag that is being circulated, hashtag Black Ivory Tower, but there are African Americans from many different industries sharing their stories that are rooted in racism, the racist behavior they've encountered in different places. And because I mainly follow people who are in education and in higher education and in the tech sector, they are strikingly similar. So it really is the case that there are some serious issues with respect to workplace environment. So they're not able to fulfill, they're not able to contribute in the way they would be able to contribute, such that we would reap the benefits of this 4.4% increase in GDP per capita. So another suggestion that I've made and that Teddy and co-authors have also made is early exposure to invention. So I've been on the board of the Lemelson Center for the Study of Invention and Innovation within the Smithsonian. There's a great lab called the Spark Lab, and there children visit this little lab and they go through the stages of not only creating an invention, but commercializing it. How do you sell a product, or how do you make it useful? And I think that's something that children have to be exposed to. And what Chetty et al. Find is that this exposure to an inventor really changes the trajectory of one's lifetime outcome. So I think it's really important. And this includes reporting and prosecuting racial harassment and misconduct. And in other research, I've certainly said that this extends to sexual harassment and misconduct. And this has to be adjudicated, because there's no way that people can really contribute in the best way, in an optimal way, if these are impediments. There are some other policy prescriptions. Marcus, did you want to jump in?
I just had some calls. John from NYU would like to know, how do you control for the quality of the invention when you do the geometric analysis? Is there a simple way to do it, or not? Or what's the approach on this dimension?
Okay, so that's a good question. Okay, so there are a couple of problems of controlling for quality. Black people are undercited there is a large literature on this, and I've looked at it for other groups too, like Russians and Soviets were undercited during the Soviet period. And what we know for African Americans is that they're undercited too. What we typically what economists typically use is citations to a patent. And if that follows a pattern that is consistent with race, then there's also a problem. So I don't use this one. I'm not sure the models that I've seen, the calculations that I've seen, have attempted to control for quality, but I think it's something worth looking at. Not in this calculation.
Okay, thanks.
But in any case, you'd want to, yes, of course, you'd want to control for quality, and I'm thinking about how you would best do that given the calculation that I've used. I'm not sure that would be straightforward, but that's something I can certainly try to include. In any case, I think that one of the things that has to be done is that we have to address the way that white supremacy has infiltrated the thinking of Americans in a way that is similar to the post-Reconstruction period of the 1870s and 1880s. So after Plessy versus Ferguson, a lot of the gains that are associated with Reconstruction in the United States were reversed. And by allowing separate but equal, you get very different outcomes. And we are showed this by Brown v. Board of Education. That's the logical, legal end, or one of the legal, well, not end. It's something that is a distant result of that suggests the reversal of Plessy versus Ferguson, that separate but equal was not equal, but many people knew that before. So what I would suggest is that the march of white supremacy sort of taking over the various elements of society needs to stop, and we have to prosecute hate crimes, and we have to implement other fundamental reforms. So what we know is that they've, and when I say we know this from the Homeland Security Report of 2009 that was suppressed, and Rand Paul and John Boehner made sure that it wasn't made public, and that led to, in 2019, a New York Times article that surprised a lot of people who saw this activity growing and growing and growing, for the New York Times article to say that many people, the FBI was surprised that white supremacy had grown so much, and now white supremacist group, white nationalism, neo-Nazi groups, right-wing extremist groups had grown so much that they couldn't control them anymore. It was difficult to think about how to control them. And we've seen this with the March on Charlottesville, for example, in 2017. Just the same kinds of white nationalist activity that we saw in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Another policy prescription would be to return military equipment to the federal government. A lot of military equipment wound up in the hands of police departments. If they have it, they're probably going to use it. So there's several ways in which the police have to be demilitarized if we're going to bring down violence in society. And there is another proposal to completely restructure police forces. And the example of Camden, New Jersey is the one that many people seem to be referring to. And there, we've seen not only the police department dismantled, but we've seen as a replacement, homicides down 50% and other crimes down in that way. And if I read it correctly, it seems like there's a large element of community policing. So there seem to be some other models that work, but what we know is that the current model is not working. And I just want to emphasize this affects not only the inventors who are African Americans, this affects everyday lives of African Americans. One story that I came across when I was responding to referee reports was that W.B. Du Bois had to leave his home, or rather leave his field work in rural Alabama and come back to Atlanta, where he was a professor at Atlanta University, buy a gun and pick up his family and move when the riot of 1906, the Atlanta riot of 1906, became full-fledged. So it's not just us, not just inventors, not just educators, not just inventors, but everybody. This is just well known because he happened to be a high-profile person and a person about whom much has been written. But this kind of harassment, kind of police harassment must stop. So with respect to other policy prescriptions, there is congressional legislation that is based on my work related to contemporary racial and gender disparities in innovation. The Success Act was passed in 2018, and it is asking to see how racial and gender disparities can be measured. And the IDEA Act is a follow-up on the Success Act. Now that we have some sort of benchmark, how do we codify this every day? And how do we address the racial wealth gap with the patent data? So both of these are instructing the patent office to take different measures, to measure who's participating in invention and innovation. And the Congress people who grilled me at the testimony were asking for ideas for closing the invention and innovation gap. And I gave them the same suggestions that I have just given. I think another way to do this is to improve opportunities for commercialization. And this is apparent in the National Academy's report on the small business invention and innovation research funding. So there are two different types of funding. One is for innovation research and the other one is for tech transfer. This is getting a lot of, it's meant to get the patents of the United States out to partners, educational partners, for example, but it's also to fill innovation gaps within the United States government and to spawn invention and innovation. So these opportunities can be broadened and deepened. And there are a lot of suggestions in that report. And this report just came out. It came out this spring. The racial wealth gap has got to be addressed. And again, COVID-19 certainly laid bare some of these disparities. For example, a Black household in Boston has roughly $8 in net worth. So if we're thinking about the disproportionate share of African Americans who lost their jobs and the disproportionate share who have been diagnosed with COVID-19, $8 is what they have as a cushion to manage and survive in this environment. And it is just, it's not meeting any standard. And certainly the wealth gap for the nation between white families and Black families is orders of magnitude different. And that's something else that has to be addressed. So those are some targeted ideas, but I would suggest that what we really need is big ideas. So recently, and I mean in the last week or so, there has been a discussion about a movement. So protest in this country often leads to policy, often leads to thinking about at least structural change or attempting to address structural change. And that is what is needed here. And that is needed to address these big systemic issues. Now, I don't know if this comes in the form of continuation and reinvigoration of the war on poverty. It was during the Nixon administration that a lot of these programs that were instituted by Johnson in the war on poverty were rolled back. And there's been a rolling back ever since. So the question is whether some of these policies and programs need to be re-implemented. We have to think about fundamental resets. And I'll just tell you a brief story about fundamental resets that are born of protest. So the man in the middle of this, this image you will recognize readily. A person you may not recognize readily is my cousin Floyd McKissick, who is on the far left side, who marched with King, was his classmate at Morehouse College, and integrated the University of North Carolina Law School. So he dreamed of and built an entire city, Soul City, North Carolina, to address the racial income, wealth, and financial gaps. what we saw in 1973, in the 1970s when this was happening, people moved there from urban areas like New York City, where they faced limited job opportunities and acute environmental racism. So they were moving to the country. When we visited Soul City, North Carolina, when I was growing up as a kid, we were driving to the middle of nowhere. It was beautiful countryside. And a lot of people were trying to find a way to start farming, for example, or to get better jobs that would allow them to have the kind of standard of living they could never obtain in these urban areas. And central to that, and going back to my research, was IBM. IBM moving there attracted many different people there to increase their job opportunities. That innovation was at the center of this was telling. And this was in the 1970s. So this isn't new. That there would be spillovers from the innovation economy to everyone in the area. This is just an advertisement for Soul City. It was considered one of the model cities. There were several model cities that were tried in the United States, but one thing that was clear was that you have to address every part of the problem to be able to make sure that people can take advantage of increase their living standards and then take advantage of the living standards of the United States more generally. So this addressed education, this addressed finance, it addressed innovation, it addressed so many things. And that's what I mean by a fundamental reset. Here is Floyd in front of the Soul City sign in Soul City, North Carolina. This is northern North Carolina. Other big ideas. So there are many big ideas already on the table. Darity and Mullen have come out with a new book on reparations, and that is something that is being discussed and debated. Sandy Darity has also put forward a job guarantee along with baby bonds. So these are ways to try and address the racial wealth gap. But what we need now is really blue sky thinking, the kind of blue sky thinking that Floyd McKissick engaged in. I'm not saying that there should be more cities, but there has to be something that is integrated, that is large, and that is fundamental to address these systemic problems and to address systemic racism. All ideas must address racism. So thank you. I look forward to your questions. If you aren't already following me at Dr. Lisa D. Cook on Twitter, please do. I look forward to engaging with you otherwise.
Thanks a lot, Lisa. So we have a few more questions I would like to throw at you.
Sure.
And hopefully you can answer them. So one question is, you focused a lot on innovation. I think innovation is very, very important also for endogenous growth and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, you can put some resources behind to help the African-American community to be better in innovation, but it helps more within the African-American, the elite part of the population. And it's not clear if you spend it more on education, it might help also the poorer part of it. Is this a concern for you, or do you think it's important to have some lighthouses in the sense that you have some very successful innovators and they are inspired in the young, poor kids as well, and that's a long-run strategy to follow? Or why is innovation the most important element compared to, you know, fixing up the police and doing other things?
I'm not suggesting that it's the most important. This is just my line of research, right? Okay. So the first line of research address violence. That's the first thing. Diminish violence. That's one thing that I would like to address. The second thing I'd like to address is setting up the conditions for participation in the innovation economy. This doesn't mean that everybody has to have a PhD in engineering. The innovation economy has many different jobs. I was pitching the innovation economy to Rwanda following its or during the process of its post-genocide IMF program, something that I was helping to negotiate. And their part of it was going to be the logistics hub of East Africa and possibly of Africa completely. And this is something that doesn't take a PhD in engineering. So there are many different parts. I mean, you have to think about every part of the innovation economy, and there are many roles for people to play. And I think it's targeting the spillovers from education that are that would produce these innovative outcomes that that we should be targeting.
Great. So another second set of questions is concerning the research you presented on lynching and leading to decline in innovation. Do you see this more as a proxy, an indirect measure,
yes.
And there's a channel, or is it direct? There's a direct link from one to the next. So that's what Hannah Foster would like to know. And if you had to sketch some channels through which this whole thing works, what would the channels look like? And I was struck that in 1899 there was this huge peak, and then it dropped off radically. What happened in 1900 that suddenly it drops off so radically? Is it a single event? You might think it might take a while and things slows down. It doesn't fall off a cliff in 1 second or 1 year.
All right, so let me start with the last question. I think the last question is a really good question, and one that I get often. So what happens after a Supreme Court ruling is that there are regulations that have put in place. There's legislation that's put in place by states. There's rulemaking. So what happened was that the 2 or 3 year lag that we typically see in rulemaking would put us right at 1899, roughly 1899, 1900, and all of these avenues were now closed. Let's say public libraries used to be open for any inventor and Black inventors as well. So they could check on what kind of innovation was coming online, what was being registered, what patents were being registered. They were just looking at USPTO reports. And all of a sudden they couldn't do that easily. They couldn't get to patent attorneys and patent agents easily. They couldn't sell their inventions to the public easily. And I recorded this in a paper on Garrett Morgan, the inventor of the traffic light and the gas mask. And I show how this rise in consumer side discrimination diminished his opportunities for innovation. So I don't remember the questions that led up to that. But yes, it's a proxy. You were asking if it's a proxy. Yes, it's a proxy. It's a proxy for the lack of rule of law. And that's a cautionary tale. And that's why I think it is applicable to countries. When I give this extended research seminar, the people who come up to talk to me about it are from China, they're from Russia, they're from Ukraine, they're from Israel, they're from Palestine. They get it. This is not locked in for African Americans. This is a cautionary tale for any society. And if you allow this kind of violence, the lack of rule of law to take hold, you're going to diminish many different outcomes. And I'm using this, using patents as a proxy for economic activity, not just for innovation.
So let me ask concerning that, there's a lack of rule of law, and it has different, intensities. Is the impact non-linear or is it linear? What's your take? So lynching is extreme violence of rule of law, but there are also maybe some smaller versions. Do you think that's if I increase intensity of the violation of the rule of law, do you think it impacts the economy is non-linear?
Right. So I use the other proxies, segregation laws and riots. So it wasn't just lynchings. It's just that lynchings had the most consistent and persistent effects. And they were, these are extrajudicial killings. And what we know from the Tulsa riot and lynchings in 1921 is that the people, the African Americans in Tulsa, felt completely abandoned. This is what the commission report said in 2000, that every level of government failed them. And that's what we're seeing now. That's what we're hearing from people in the streets now, is that every level of government is failing them. So that's why they're in the streets. That's why they're risking getting COVID-19. That's why they are so adamant about addressing this particular issue, and it's a systemic issue. It's a proxy for something else. It's a proxy for racism that has been allowed and has infected every part of our economy. And the kind of inequality that we keep talking about is something that is a symptom of this kind of racism. So that's something that fundamentally has to be addressed.
Another question concerning, you know, what the Seoul city tries to do, in a sense, is to be a lighthouse, to be a role model of how to do things. And
Yes.
historically, you see, for example, in Europe, you know, there was some persecution of some minorities, and they were fleeing then to some other country, and were very innovative in this new country, like the Huguenots came to Germany at some point. And do you see something in your analysis too, that some, you know, minority is suppressed and they have to flee somewhere, and then they come to a particular area, they get a special place to live there, and then they're extremely innovative, and you see a spur of innovation? See this?
You know, I didn't see that. I didn't see that in the data. I didn't see that in the data, but I think you raise a really interesting point. First, inventors were much more mobile than the average person, and that's true for all inventors. They're much more mobile. They're going to go where the opportunities are. So we had the African American inventors, and my data set were largely located outside the South. So in the mid-Atlantic region around New York and New Jersey, and in the Midwest, but not in the South. So I would say that yes, and they were escaping, if they were moving, they were escaping the lack of opportunity in the South with more opportunities in the North, but not violence-free opportunities in the North. So when Garrett Morgan was inventing, say, this traffic light or this gas mask, he also faced this kind of violence. The example that I gave you of my cousin Percy Julian at Glidden, he faced this kind of violence. So this is not, I think, an extreme case. It's an everyday thing, and it's not stopping. It's possibly taken a different form, but it's still fundamental violence, and it addresses personal security, and personal security is absolutely necessary if you're going to do productive things like knowledge creation. And this is something that I found in Russia too, when I was writing my dissertation in Russia. Same circumstances, same outcomes.
I mean, there's, of course, it's hard to say, but if you look at the Jewish community, they're also prosecuted all the time, but they're extremely innovative. So they invent a lot, and they have a lot of investment in human capital, because so that's another example.
Yeah, a lot of them left, right. A lot of them left Russia and came here. And
Yes.
I found patents in both places, in Tsarist Russia and in America, where a number of Jews settled. So yes, that can happen. That can happen. Not sure that African Americans can escape racism in the same way. I mean, this is a very phonetically driven racism that exists in the U.S. So not sure that that can happen as easily.
And let me close with a final question from Felipe. You would like to know, what can other countries learn from the experience of the United States, in particular Brazil and other countries who might have similar challenges as the US has? Do you have any particular lessons for other countries? I mean, you mentioned Rwanda and...
Right. So I think that there are two. I think the first lesson is that the innovation economy is much broader than the one that includes only PhDs and in engineering. So you have to figure out the chain that would lift everybody into higher living standards, from logistics to design to the commercialization of invention. So there I think has to be a lot more of this, a lot more investment, and I think also a lot more investment in getting rid of racism, and that's the second one. So that means that we're attacking what leads to these racial disparities, these health disparities, these schooling disparities, the disparities both related to access to credit. So we have to tackle the systemic problem. We can't just sort of dance around it and say, because that seems to be what's been done in the past, and that's why people are protesting. That so much of this has been accepted and become a part of American life that it has to be rolled back. And I would say for places like Brazil, or well, Brazil, I know a bit more about having taught something on Brazil before. The same kind of racism exists, or similar kinds of racism exist, and that's a legacy of slavery. They had more slaves, I think, or Latin America had more slaves than the United States did. So this is a particular legacy that has to be addressed. For Rwanda, I think one has to think about stages. Becoming the DHL hub or something like that, the FedEx hub of Africa, is a great thing. And they can build on that. They had a 98% digital infrastructure when I left, when I was there. So it laid the groundwork for a lot of different possibilities to raise their living standards. Now, they had to invest in education. They were focusing on logistics because they wanted to build the MIT of East Africa as well. But that was going to be down the road, and that was going to be after much more investment in education. So I think we have to think about it sequentially, but I think we have to address these systemic issues first, because otherwise we're doing what has been done in the past, and that doesn't seem to have been so useful.
Thanks a lot, Lisa. This was really a big picture and specialized on innovation as a proxy, you know, what the challenges we are facing, and things are changing, and hopefully for the better. And that's the good sign. We always stop with a good message at the end, because it makes us
there's hope. There's absolutely hope.
Thanks a lot, Lisa. It was a pleasure
having
you all here with us, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.